Step into analysis, please.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we are discussing the possible Season 5 plot in general, as well as one of my favorite theories to date, Cats in the Cradle 2. Which is kind of a continuation of the Cats in the Cradle theory from Season 2, but ultimately is kind of its own thing. I have taken my customary break after a season of vigorous content creation, and I am now back in your YouTube experience with my stream of consciousness to, wreak havoc. Today we're overthinking the one and only HBO show about robots, Westworld. Season 4 ends with all sentient life on Earth destroyed and a seemingly omniscient Dolores narrating this, or Christina narrating this, which would be odd because she is inside of the Sublime. However, we don't really see where this Dolores voice is coming from. If they are escaping into the Sublime that has the ability to recreate life in such a way that everybody inside of the Sublime would believe that their reality is real and true, then I would wager that this could have happened before, and this could be any number of Dolores that has needed to create their own world to escape the impending doom of host and humankind. It would mean the story that we're watching is a cyclical dive into this time-space continuum, with our heroes diving deeper and deeper into the Sublime Matrix, fully believing each of their realities is the true reality, because after all, if you can't tell, does it really matter? The Dolores speaking about life on this version of Earth dying could be the Dolores that created this version of the world from memory, just as Christina is going to do inside of the Sublime. Like we really don't know if Dolores/Christina will be fully awake during this test, or if she will choose to exist in maybe her most true fidelitous form. This was a question that we had about how the hosts were living inside of the Sublime, and how they were actually perceiving their reality with this last season. And if they would choose to be this seemingly unfeeling god like Akishita, or if they would sacrifice their control to make their lives seem more real and genuine like they had once before. Ignorance is kind of bliss in a situation like this, where you could either choose to feel everything and all of the pain in the world and understand that you are responsible for everything that is happening, or you could choose to go back to your loop, genuinely go back to being Dolores without ever knowing or remembering that she was the god that created this world. And if that's true, then who's to say that that has not happened before? The point is, Christina will recreate the entire world inside of the Sublime with the goal of the creation of one last game, a dangerous game with the highest of stakes, survival or extinction. They say that this game ends where it began, in a world like a maze that tests who we are. Now, when I hear that, I literally think of Westworld. I literally think of the world, this entire plot that we've gone through. I think the game, which if you're watching this video, you've already lost. That's a 90s game joke. Well done, me. I think it's this entire process, though. It's the park, it's the story, it's the awakening, it's the choices that lead William to ending the world. It's literally all of this. And just like the simulation theory of our own reality, the chances that we were the first version of humanity to simulate life in a digital or even like a metaphysical cosmic dust kind of way is pretty unlikely, right? If simulation exists, then we are one of many simulations, either at the end of that stream or just in a matrix of streams that are happening, right? And there's a really a pretty low chance that we are the first people and first version of our own reality that are actually doing this simulation of life. So we could be seeing the first host and humankind escape into the simulated world. Like, this could be the very first time that this ever happens, or this could be only one of a long chain of this happening. Just like, again, we debate in real life. Now, let's address some of those points, because I think that I'm kind of inferring a lot of this thing. So let's talk about, firstly, why we think that they're going to be recreating the entire world. Well, it was kind of the point of Christina's storyline, right? It's how she was able to recreate and manifest the people that she interacted with. It was the purpose that we saw how, true to life that they were, to such a high degree that not even herself, the creator, knew that they were fake. And again, I think that her not knowing, or that ignorance of her own creation, we may see that again in season 5 if she chooses to give up that control to lead her own life again. She also has access to the park data. This was something that again, we talked about in a previous video where all of the bad guys in the entire show have been after this data, but we've never seen it used for good, only a prize for villains to go after. It was sealed away with the Sublime in season 2, the key and the park data kind of merged together at some point, and now they were sent away, and so we have all of this data, all of this technology, all of this simulation in one spot. And I think now that both of those are together with this storyteller at the helm, I think that they will be creating the most true digital reality that could ever exist, and maybe to such a high degree that it's impossible. There will be no black bars kind of thing. So we have an unknown Dolores telling us that sentient life on Earth has died, but inside of the Sublime, we really don't know how they are viewing the world outside of that gilded cage. In fact, the only way that Bernard was able to quote unquote see the world for what it was is because of the projected data detailing how the world could exist and not how it actually was existing. It's just a projection. It's not a camera pointing out and actively scanning and receiving new data about the fidelity of the world. Just the predictive algorithm using deterministic laws to create a nearly perfect image of reality. And he used that to run through possibility after possibility until he found one in which the right outcome could be obtained, which was literally for Christina to recreate the planet inside of the Sublime. So again, I think that Christina will create the most perfect version of reality, of a simulated reality. And just like I said before, I think that this could have happened in a previous cycle of this. And since this was Bernard's plan in the end, I think we should also trace that backwards and maybe figure out if Bernard had some kind of insight into this as well. Maybe he figured out a similar thing and realized that we were always heading here. So let's go to Dolores giving him the key at the end of season 2, and then giving him the briefcase to access the Sublime. And before that, meeting with Arnold's wife, which was instructed by her as well. I think because we're never told why these things are explicitly happening, it's because Dolores figured this out long before everybody, and has kind of been putting that plan into motion. Everybody except for Rehoboam, and also maybe Ford as well. There is kind of like a really interesting thing, like the fact that this is now when he decided to reinstate the reveries and launch this entire plot, which ultimately is why the world is over right now. Regardless, that's not actually what I wanted to talk about. In season 3, they keep talking about this end of humanity, this fated to die for an unknown reason pinnacle moment. Multiple times, this vague final destination is alluded to. Bernard says that what is going to happen was always going to happen. Sirach and his brother were just fighting off the inevitable, but it's left vague for a purpose. The context of this is like, the world has just been spun into chaos. How could none of this ultimately have an effect on the trajectory of where everything is going? It doesn't really make sense. And I'm sorry, not that it doesn't make sense, but that it's left for interpretation, right? I think that specifically that is happening so that after the fact, it can have a double meaning. Most directly, of course, the end of the world, but also our transition to a digital existence. That is something that we will do. There is an inevitable point in humankind in which we will realize that we could exist as data, it just in a very similar Sublime kind of way. We could attach ourselves to a satellite. We could hover around any number of stars and literally just exist inside of a virtual Eden, similar to the Sublime. Based on the comments, the number one issue with this is that people don't view the Sublime as reality. I am fully convinced that this is basically a masterpiece of storytelling that, when complete, will show the audience exactly how our own reality may be a simulation, but a good number of comments have expressed that they still want the story to go back to Earth, and that they consider reality that, because that is ultimately what matters. That is where the Sublime is physically hosted, and that is where hosts and humans can really be free without interference or oversight of any singular entity. And of course, this entity would be Dolores that will be recreating them. There's a really interesting power dynamic there. I think that she may wipe her memory again and choose to forfeit this power in some meaningful way so that all people can truly exist and feel equal once again. Regardless of us currently viewing the Sublime as somehow lesser, I think Season 5 will do something to convince us either this entire thing is just a string of simulated worlds, or that the new Sublime reality will be accepted as the true reality, and ultimately the audience should do that as well. I think there's a few ways that they could write that would ultimately cement this idea and make it pretty obvious that this is the reality that we should care about. One of the hurdles they would need to write for is how the physical world and the Sublime storage data center would still be subjected to the physics of this reality, and how people would, still have that in the back of their mind. And what I mean when I say that is that the dam could flood, it could blow up, the god of that world could just stop caring. I don't know. The point is, the Sublime is subjected to the reality that it is contained inside of, and they need to write for that. And I think that they could do this using the world building that they have already created with time and how we perceive time. 1 year in Christina's original world would be 1,000 years in the Sublime. Perhaps Christina's world has a Sublime with the same rules. And while everything is playing out in real time for us, if this was a string of simulated realities inside of an evergreen descending Sublimes, maybe the start of this entire chain is comparatively passing at 1/10,000th of a second. This entire plot, if they could somehow observe the first Dolores or whatever entity started simulating realities, it would look as though time were standing still, just as we saw with Maeve in Season 3, time inside of the simulation makes time outside of the simulation appear much slower. So what's to stop them from escaping deeper and deeper until that very first timeline where, say they doomed humanity in 100 years isn't now moving so slow that the conscious minds of host and human could virtually live forever? There could be a flood in the physical Sublime data storage center, but because we're so far down the Sublime, time is moving so unimaginably slow that ultimately nothing is happening in the very first existence of this medium. And also the other thing is with data processing power, right? And the way that they could explain this is child processes taking less time is taking less resources. It ultimately wouldn't need to be as powerful because of how it was created. Processing power may be a hurdle to overcome. It also might be something that I'm only considering because I'm in IT. And ultimately, in terms of a story, it doesn't fucking matter. They could live forever in harmony or something like that, going deeper and deeper. I think it's entirely possible, 100%. But I don't really know what the point would be, right? Are we just continuing to exist because we can? Yes, because that's what we fucking do. In my opinion, I think more impactfully, she is testing to see if she could avoid this fate for host and humanity. I still believe this is a story about William and the evil that he became, and I think this test could be about identifying if William, and thus the entirety of humanity, is doomed to repeat these mistakes given a second chance, or if something could change and avoid him ushering in the doom of this world. Outliers and maybe all beings having the ability to choose great good or great evil really paints the picture that we've seen the duality of good and bad with Dolores. Now we need to see the duality of man with William. And with the ending of Season 5, we have the most evil William that could exist. So I think it's time for a reality where William does not end the entire world with his actions. And maybe we accept that as the true reality, with everybody believing themselves to be free and have free will and body autonomy just as we do right now. Dolores's test, or her game, could be written in a countless number of ways, trying to isolate where everything went wrong. But ultimately, that is what I think that we're shooting for here, and how they could have avoided the end of humanity. But most impactfully, I think where this test would concentrate on is, of course, William. And maybe it's as simple as what would happen if William never attended Westworld. This entire thing could have been avoided, though I still feel like there's something more, right? I don't think that William is evil incarnate, but a victim of circumstance. And as such, anyone in his position could have done the same things that led to this outcome. It cannot be as simple as Ford doesn't accept William's help because he is fundamentally broken and then proceeds to accept somebody else, Because William isn't the devil, just a straight white male who was taught to conquer the world from an early age. My point is not to reduce his identity to those points, which I don't think that we should do, but highlight that for the majority of human history, we have been taught stories of heterosexual cis male leaders who dominate the world and do so because they don't care about the voices that oppose them. We glorify these stories. We can't get enough of them. And why the fuck would we think that William is the only person who would have became this fabled beast given his position? We wonder how people like Elon Musk could exist when we all watched Scrooge McDuck slide down a mountain of gold and go, yeah, I mean, that's an appropriate thing to do with your money. Fetishize it, hoard it, protect yourself above all else. And it's really important for me to clarify that I'm not saying any of these variables inherently lead to egomaniacs that put their own lives so far ahead of the others that they view themselves as titans. But I do want to point out how these variables could add to the billions of other variables that position people like William, Ford, Elon Musk, and even you, viewer, listening to some random disembodied voice on the internet. All of these things could position you for great good or great evil, and I think that Dolores' test will be to figure out exactly what variables went into positioning William to become what he became. And yeah, I do think in terms of storytelling, this test or this thing that we're searching for will be represented in a singular point where all of these things went horribly wrong. And I think that Dolores may even struggle to isolate that point. It could relate to any human, but again, William seems to be the most likely candidate for who we're focusing on. It may also be impossible, like perhaps the park should not have opened at all. But more on that a little bit later. I think the mental health aspect that I'm always telling myself and you exists as a core pillar of this show will present itself here, highlighting how all of these great men and women were affected by their trauma, and maybe the fact that William should not have been permitted to the park because of his mental health not being able to withstand what would ultimately happen here. To enforce this, I want to bring up the interview process whenever someone is coming into the park. When William first entered, they asked about his health, if he had any history of mental illness, and instead of treating this moment with any kind of seriousness, he jokes about having a fear of clowns without giving, again, any consideration to the question. This is a taught action, and she even makes a point to bring this up and asks if this is what he commonly does whenever discussing mental health. He probably has not given much consideration to his own mental health or mental illness, because like most people, he's convinced himself that his experience is standard, the default, and we can just say, hey, it is what it is, and then we make jokes when it comes time to talking about our own mental health. So even from an early age, the societal shortcomings of his time positioned him to not take this seriously and to then go into a park that traumatized him and thus spiraled the world into chaos. We see this same interview process in the present, and history repeats itself. Caleb is asked if he has any mental illness that should be noted and or that would affect him in any kind of way, and Maeve interjects and moves the conversation along. Caleb even wants to stop and question why this would matter, and I think that is exactly what they want us to do. Question the actual process of going to the park and if we are capable of doing this, just like we had this same debate during season 1. It's like coming full circle in a really impactful way here. William should have never gone to the park because of his underlying conditions, but he did because he was hanging with the bros and society taught him, hey, do not give 2 seconds to your, mental health. Do not worry about that shit, because what are you going to do, right? It is what it is. But we can see not much has changed in the future because Caleb is only afforded 2 seconds before then being pushed along. Maybe next time this process will do a better job. Maybe it'll be 4 seconds. Maybe the next time this process occurs, we do a better job of making sure people are, properly capable of experiencing Westworld without turning into paranoid sociopaths that murder their daughters because their incessant need to question reality demands that everything is ultimately fake. That seems like a real domino effect there, Westworld. The park is ultimately what fucked William, and I don't think that he is the only person responsible for Emily's death. The point is not to say that nobody should go to Westworld, though maybe the point is that nobody should go to Westworld. The point is that allowing people that could be subjected to the possible PTSD that this place can give you is something that should not have happened. Something that we need to care about with proper vetting and a greater understanding of our emotional intelligence and our mental health. Westworld could exist, but it would need to exist in a much different way that ensured that right amount of hurt that they talked about, like in season 1, allowing you to get the right amount of hurt needs to be better defined, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so how does this make a good story? Does the show just end with Dolores going, okay, William isn't allowed in, and in this version of humanity, we vet people better before allowing them to interact with the hosts? Is that really the most meaningful story that we could tell? Maybe, but if you'll indulge me, I have a theory that I think may pull all of this together with one very important thing happening, and why all of this talk about mental health and how they could create a future that does not suck for everybody and the way in which time is being manipulated here could all make sense and be true. And it would bring us back to the main reality in which most people still value more than the sublime reality. If this entire thing was the Cradle, and Arnold's last-ditch effort to show Ford what exactly would happen if they opened the park to the public. In reality, no time has passed at all. It's the Cradle being used to show us exactly how everything would feel inside of the simulation from the perspectives of the minds that are inside of it. All of these people and stories we cared about may, in the main reality, not exist, granting so much power to understanding how the host minds would genuinely feel while experiencing these memories and the predictive algorithm that would blossom into who they became, as well as provide the scope for the time that passes from each perspective. Most of us care the most about this reality, which is why so many have a hard time saying that it is okay to exist in the sublime and ultimately restart again. What if the reason that we have gotten only just a tiny little bit of the story of Arnold and Ford when they worked together in the park for all of those years before it opened is because this entire thing is still a part of that story that's being told. Arnold is using the simulation technology to do exactly what Bernard did in both season 2 and season 4. The season would end with Dolores finding the flaw in the system that humanity and our understanding of our own mental health is literally so infantile that opening this park, regardless of who is funding it, would always lead to our downfall. The black bars would fade and we'd see Arnold and Ford leaving the Cradle, Ford finally willing to see his partner's perspective and knowing that if he didn't, not only would Arnold take his own life in an attempt to stop Ford, but that continuing regardless of that would lead to the end of the world. And 35 years later, him realizing his mistake. In this reality with millions of processes that were Bernard simulating the futures that, could ultimately happen, Ford would have to accept that this is fact, that no matter what happens, this is where we will lead. And maybe we just should not open Westworld. It would be an absolute mindfuck of a final moment of a series and cement its place as a show that gave us a brilliant story about simulation theory, about time dilation, about mental health, and most importantly, about robots. Robots, or more precisely androids, so advanced that they could exist as the next generation of mankind, and it really wouldn't be that big of a deal, because ultimately it would highlight that our consciousness is the thing worth protecting, the real us, and its analog or digital form really wouldn't matter from the perspective of the conscious being. Just like the discussion between Billiam and William denotes, it's not simply enough to trade your brain for a CPU or hard drives. We must understand how we are creating these thoughts and actions. And I think the best way to do that or show that story is to show the very real deterministic ripple effect that we have or are subjected to with trauma and everything else that we experience in a deterministic universe, and ultimately highlight exactly how William could have become the purely evil executioner or just a man who loves his family and tries to see the beauty of the world like he was before he came to Westworld. Those are my full and complete thoughts about how I think that this story could unfold. And just to provide some final evidence about the Cats in the Cradle 2 theory, look at the season 4 finale when everything is coming undone. Everything shows this red phasing effect, which of course is the exact color of the Cradle system and the room that it is hosted inside of. The same cradle that we just casually learned they used for years without, before the park opened, they used this for years without us ever really diving into that process or seeing them doing this. And it's the same system that we're directly called to remember with Bernard's dialogue to Frankie just recently, only a few episodes ago. This would be a great twist, in my opinion, seeing that the opening of this park was the doom of humanity, and more precisely that Ford just needed to listen to his partner and his friend, Arnold. That has my whole heart, and that moves me. You see, in my complete timeline video, I really romanticize their relationship because we have such little information about these two. But in my head, as I put all of these pieces together, this level of friendship and determination would have to be so real. I don't think that many of us could possibly relate to it. But it is definitely more than just two business partners, right? Seeing as Ford literally recreates the closest thing he could to his best friend just so he can continue seeing him around at the office every day. I mean, who's doing that, right? The same friend that knew Ford's life so intimately that he recreated his childhood vacation home and family for him in those early days. I mean, there's a real love between those two. And I think that this is something that could be tapped into with this big reveal. I'm not saying it's inherently a romantic thing. It very well could be, but I do think that there is a great friendship between these two. And I think that in this final season, being reminded of this would be pretty spectacular. In a very direct way, William and Ford have always had this really interesting dynamic that has maybe felt a little underexplored, right? As investor, as an artist, I kind of get it. There's something odd between this relationship that feels like there could be something deeper there. I think William seeing the burned pariah and learning that this is what happens when you let the storyline play its course would mirror Ford seeing the world that we're experiencing in ruin and learning that this is what happens if you let this story play its course. The reason their dynamic feels off is because this is genuinely the off-putting nature of these two men who prioritize their own success over everything else. And this is how they would interact with each other. So I'm not saying that it's a bad relationship. I think that there's like a little cherry on top that's missing, or something that could really show the audience how similar these are because of their own stories leading them on very similar routes of destruction. In season 1, Ford quotes Oppenheimer, "The man who believed his inventions ushered in the end of the world." Does that sound familiar? And instead of needing 35 years to correct Ford's mistake, instead of becoming death, destroyer of worlds, Ford just needs to listen to his best friend in that single pinnacle moment and not open the park. I think Dolores and the others could exist in this reality and in real physical forms, but it wouldn't be a reality where they were abused and the standard was that they must suffer in order to awaken. A reality that acknowledges the birth of a new sentient being that maybe would even need to be protected until everybody knew, or they knew, how to announce their creation to the world. But regardless, Ford would never lose his friend. He would never be subjecting hosts to the cruelty of mankind, and he would never need to correct that mistake 35 years later after realizing, hey, Akichita this was a real dude this entire time. Maybe I fucked up. And thus, because of Arnold running a simulation about what could happen, just like Bernard does, humanity would be saved. This journey backwards could also highlight Ford's family life and how that negative environment shaped the man who he became, one that was so dedicated to achieving his dreams that he disregarded the people around him in order to get what he wanted. The people that were begging him to listen, the people that felt that they needed to kill themselves in order to stop this great atrocity from happening. Just like William does when he becomes the man that he feels that he needs to become, and his family and Logan and all of the people around him are ultimately the ones who suffer. That right there, that thought, that is pinnacle storytelling, and it would make every rewatch feel better than the last. William and Ford's time on screen would be showing us generations of broken men pushing their own agenda while the world around them suffers, and while always believing that they had the right to do so because hurt people hurt people. Maybe the maze doesn't simply represent the host's journey to consciousness, but maybe as Arnold studied it and tackled the emotional trauma that is losing a child, he realized that it was a symbol that all of us needed to be introspective and find our true selves in that process. But with that, we come to the end of the video. Special thank you to all of the wonderful people over on Patreon that support this content: Michael Link, Praveen Mysore, and Brandyn Fitzgerald. If you have any evidence for or against either of these theories, or just simply want to tell me that you hate them or love them, please do so by leaving a comment down below and liking, or I guess disliking, this video as well. Ultimately, I want to keep the conversation going, and yeah, I thank you all for being here and listening to my video. Regardless of what happens, I do hope that we get a season 5, as I believe there is a strong finish that is coming up, and one that the world should take to heart. Much love, everybody, and I cannot wait to talk to you all again soon.